All right, guys, we're back for lesson 4. Let's get a little more makeup work done. Okay, just as always, we're doing the 3-read method of this poem. And once we get to the third read and we start looking at the questions, what we're looking at is figurative language. So remember, those are our eye shampoos. And it's also things like imagery, anything where you're looking at how the poem has been written, where it's not literal. They're using that beautiful poetic language to create and to write. So, looking at Fig Lang, we call them our eye shampoos. And the thing I want you to know before we even start is there's a bunch they can ask about, but most of the time in 8th grade, they ask about similes and metaphors. Okay, so here we go. First read, again, just reading for what we know. Don't worry about what you don't know. The first thing I notice right off the bat when I read the title invitation is that there's no capitalization. And remember, we pay attention to capitalization. So since it just sticks out, I'm going to look at the poem before reading. I'm just scanning the words. And no, there's no capitalization. I'm no, and there's no, it's not just that there's no capitalization, I noticed that, but there's no places where they put in weird capitalization, except for this word frost down here, right here, frost, but that's a name. So, yeah, no weird capitalization. All right, so here we go. First read. I'm only going to make notes on what I know. Used to write poetry in art class when the teacher wasn't looking. Okay, author wrote poetry. But now I don't take art and I can't afford not to pay attention in my classes. Now I write poetry in my free time, but that's difficult. Okay, uh, can't write in class anymore. Got that so far. Okay. Because words don't appear like a dog when you call their name. No, poetry is anything but convenient. Right now it's 1:05 a.m. because poetry shook me by the shoulders and said, "Hey, this is important, but now I'm wondering if the lack of sleep is worth it. I feel I'm always weighing time by the quality." Boy, this is weird. I'm not understanding much of this. Of poems written, because even when the words grace me with their presence, they don't always choose to step delicately into the world. Pink shoes. Wow, I don't. Okay, this is super weird. I'm not getting a lot of this, but here's what I do know. He's talking about, or she's talking about poetry. The author's talking about poetry. I get that much. If that's all I get, that's all I get, and that's okay. First read. I am always weighing time by the quality of poems written. I'm back on line 15 for everybody. Because even when the words grace me with their presence, they don't always choose to step delicately into the world. Pink shoes, treading softly over the white horizon. Usually, poetry slops lazily over the couch of a page and dangles while I remove its muddy shoes and rearrange the pillows, all the while muttering something about frost and how maybe his comments against free verse were right all along. Poetry and rhyme always cleans up after itself, although honestly, you haven't lived until the homeless free verse poem on your couch decides to stay up for a cup of tea, and if you're lucky, lets you take notes on everything he says. Wow, okay. This is a hard one for me. Hardest one we've read so far. I got about 10% of that. I know he's talking about poetry. Okay, so let me go back. Second read. Title is Invitation. Invitation. Still don't get it. I know it has something to do with poetry. All right, so here's the thing that we've been talking about. We've been talking about reading to the punctuation, right? So that second time, instead of reading to the end of the line like you're used to, like we read it this time, we're going to read to the commas and the periods and see if it helps. Okay, second time reading to punctuation. Here we go. Used to write poetry in art class when the teacher wasn't looking. Okay, got it. He used to write poetry. But now I don't take art and I can't afford not to pay attention in my classes. Well, that makes more sense. So he can't write poetry in school anymore. We got that, okay? Now I write poetry in my free time, but that's difficult because words don't appear like a dog when you call their name. Okay, so it's poetry is hard to write. He said it's difficult. Poetry is difficult because words don't appear like a dog when you call their name. Okay, we're going to notice that next time. That's figurative language. Okay, so if I could highlight, and I can't because the way I put this in here, I would just come in and underline because words don't appear like a dog when you call their name because that's fig lang. So since I can't just highlight, I'm going to put it over here and I'm going to put it in a different color because words don't appear like a dog when you call their name. Okay, and I'm just going to highlight it over here because that's what I have to do. Let's use Park Boys. There you go, fig lang. I got to think about that one. Okay. No, poetry is anything but convenient. Poetry is not convenient. Okay, poetry is not convenient. That's just my notes. Okay, here we go. Right now it's 1:05 a.m. because poetry shook me by the shoulders and said, "Hey, this is important." But now I'm wondering if the lack of sleep is worth it. Uh, okay, so poetry woke him up. How do I know that? Because it said poetry shook me by the shoulders and said, "Hey, this is important." Okay, that's figurative language. Poetry can't literally shake you by the shoulders and say this is important, but that's what the poets do to show me that he got woken up by a poem, but now he's wondering if the sleep is worth it. I'm right here on line 13. I feel I am always weighing time by the quality of poems written, because even when the words grace me with their presence, they don't always choose to step delicately into the world. Still too much for me, but it's okay. Pink shoes treading softly over the white horizon. Yeah, I don't know what that means, but I know it's figurative language because he doesn't literally mean it. Something is pink shoes treading softly over the white horizon. This is where my brain goes, please don't ask me a question about this. Usually, poetry slops lazily over the couch of a page and dangles while I remove its muddy shoes and rearrange the pillows, all the while muttering something about Frost and how maybe his comments against free verse were right all along. Okay, so again, I don't know what it means, this second read, but poetry slops lazily over the couch of a page and dangles while I remove its muddy shoes and rearrange the pillows. So I don't get what he's talking about, but I get the picture in my head that he's comparing it to like a little kid that's dangling their shoes over the couch and you're having to take its shoes off and like rearrange the pillows. So I get the picture, but I don't know what it means. So I'm right here where on line 25. Poetry and rhyme always cleans up after itself. So poetry and rhyme is clean. He's saying poetry and rhyme is clean. So poetries that rhyme at the end, he's saying are clean. I get that much. I don't know, but I get that he's saying that they're clean. Okay. So clean, like they're easier to read, I think is what he's saying. Although honestly, you haven't lived until the homeless free verse poem on your couch decides to stay for a cup of tea. And if you're lucky, lets you take notes on everything he says. So I don't get it, but I know that he's comparing free verse poetry to a homeless person on your couch. All right. So here we go. I want you to notice something. I am not this poem is not like just making a ton of sense to my brain after two reads. But I'm understanding about 50% of it. But look how much we got. We know we got that he's writing about how it's difficult to write poetry. We know he uses all these figurative languages that we need to kind of come back and we're probably going to get questions about this to try to figure out. But he's talking about the fact that it's hard to write poetry, that it shows up at night when you're in the middle of a dream and wakes you up. And you got if you're a poet, you got to feel like you got to get it down on paper. And we know he's saying that somehow free verse poem that doesn't rhyme and is messy, kind of like this one, is more honest than poems that are clean and all rhyme and sound like poetry you think it should sound like, but maybe it's more real somehow because it's like a homeless, I don't know, it's because it's like this raw homeless person. That's all I got. I didn't get all of it, but that's okay. Third read, let's go to the questions. So here's the kind of questions you're going to get. Look at all this. There's a ton of figurative language questions. In the third stanza, the poet uses the metaphor of blank to emphasize that. The metaphor in the third stanza is used to emphasize what? The poet uses lines in simile to reveal that the speaker. So you notice what they're asking. They're asking you how they're using the simile, how they're using the metaphor, how they're using personification. Those are the questions you're going to get. So everything in blue, that's what you're going to get questions about. What did the poet mean when he used the personification or the simile? Because words don't appear like a dog when you call their name. So stop and think. What does that mean? Well, what does a dog do when you call their name? Well, it immediately comes to you if it's a good dog. But when you're writing a poem, just because you say, hey, I need these words, they don't necessarily show up in your brain. That's what that simile means. So you just got to come back and think through that line that they're asking you to think through. And again, start with what you know. You don't get the whole thing, but you know what happens when you call a dog. Okay, well, if that's what happens when you call a dog, and you know this poem is about it's hard to write poetry, what's he saying about the words? Slowly put the ideas together based on what you do know, and you'll usually get there. All right, this was a little bit longer because we had a lot to talk about, and that was a difficult poem. Sorry about that, but we're done now. Go on to your quiz. There's only 4 questions instead of 5. Hope you're able to work through the figurative language. And remember, mostly focus on similes and metaphors. Have a good day.